In this video, we're going to closely examine 10 problems with the popular Christian doctrine concerning the Antichrist, Tribulation, and Abomination of Desolation. And after this, hopefully you will see that we are much closer to the coming in the clouds than most Christians think. The standard doctrine is based upon several scriptures, and because it's a Christian doctrine, we're going to start with what Jesus said about it. In Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus said, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let those in Judea flee into the mountains." And in verse 21, he adds, "For then shall be great tribulation." This event is extremely important to Christians and anyone else who believes in the prophecy, because Jesus says after the tribulation of those days, the stars will fall and the Son of Man will come in the clouds. So this abomination of desolation standing in the holy place is extremely important because it must occur along with the tribulation of those days before the Son of Man comes in the clouds. So what is the abomination of desolation? There's an enormous amount of speculation about this and different doctrines that it can be confusing for anyone who has not read and understood the book of Daniel, because Jesus himself told us he's not referring to just any abomination, but he's referring specifically to the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about. The Hebrew word for abomination shows up in 3 places in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, chapter 11, and chapter 12. Daniel 9 verse 27 says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." Then Daniel 11 verse 31 says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." And Daniel 12 verse 11 says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." So popular Christian doctrines create a timeline that looks something like this. The abomination of desolation will stand in a temple in the midst of the final 7 years, and at that point the sacrifice and oblation will cease, and specifically they believe the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place exactly 3.5 years from the start of the final 7 years. The way they came up with this timeline is fairly simple and only involves 5 main chapters in the Bible: Matthew 24, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12, and Revelation 12. The reasoning goes something like this. Daniel chapter 12 talks about the time of trouble, and if you look at the definition of this word translated as trouble, you can see it also means tribulation, and it seems to relate to Jesus' tribulation in Matthew 24. So Daniel 12 verse 1 says, "There will be a time of trouble or tribulation," and then in verses 6 and 7 they ask, "How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?" And the answer is, "It shall be for a time, times and half." So Daniel 12 seems to be saying that the Matthew 24 tribulation will last for a time, times and a half. And that same time period is also mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 verse 25. It says, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of a time." And this is referring to the little horn. In the verse just before that it says, "And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings." So it's talking about another horn that rises out of 10 horns. Verse 21 says, "I beheld, and that same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them." And in verses 7 and 8, it explains that the horn is a little horn that comes out of the 4th beast. And it adds that in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So the Christian doctrine says this little horn is a man, and this man will wear out the saints, change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of a time. The time, times, and half a time is the time of trouble. Daniel 12 tells us that. And Daniel 7 says the saints will be given into the hand of the little horn during that time. But the time, times, and half a time is also mentioned in Revelation chapter 12, verse 14. It says, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the face of the serpent." So the Christian doctrine says the woman will fly at the start of that time, times, and half a time, and that is the time of trouble when the little horn is standing in the sanctuary. And then they realize that Revelation chapter 12 says almost exactly the same thing in verse 6. It says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." 1 score is 20, so 3 score is 60. So that's a period of 1,260 days. So at first glance, that seems to be the answer as to how long the time times in half a time is. The woman flees at the start of a period of 1,260 days, and that seems at first glance to be equal to a time times in half a time. So it seems to say the saints will be given into the hand of the little horn for a time times in half a time, which is equal to 1,260 days, and that is the tribulation period Jesus spoke of. Then they realize that 1,260 days literally equals 3.5 years, and 3.5 years is exactly half of the final 7 years in Daniel 9. So that seems to make sense. A covenant will be signed at the start of a 7-year period. Then in the midst of that 7-year period, exactly 3.5 years later, the man who represents the little horn will stand in the sanctuary, the holy place, and the sacrifice and oblation will be taken away, and the final 3.5-year time of trouble will start, which represents the Great Tribulation. So at first glance, all of that may seem to fit together perfectly. However, as I said before, there are at least 10 problems with their theory that we're going to go over right now. The first problem is Daniel 12 says that from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation set up, there shall be 1,290 days, not 1,260 days. So if their timeline is right, and the sacrifice is taken away at the same time the abomination of desolation is set up, exactly 3.5 years after the start of the final 7 years, then the 1,290 days would run parallel to the final 1,260 days, except they would exceed what should represent the end of the 70th week. So some might say it's just a small amount of time, only 30 days, and not a big deal. But that's just the first problem with their timeline, not the biggest problem. The second problem, and the biggest problem that I can see, is that they completely disregard the exact timeline of events given in Daniel chapter 11. They started outright going to the book of Daniel, just like Jesus said, to find what Daniel said about the abomination of desolation. But then they were sidetracked so much by chapter 9, chapter 12, chapter 7, and chapter 8 that they completely ignored chapter 11. Chapter 11 is extremely important because it tells us exactly what the abomination of desolation was and when exactly it was placed. The standard doctrine uses verse 31 of chapter 11, but they don't consider it in the context of the whole chapter. And even if they were to think the chapter 11 timeline of events spans over 2,500 years, that would mean 2,500 years would occur between verses 1 through 31, because the abomination occurs in verse 31. But verses 31 through 45, they say, are simultaneous, because verse 45 is when the Antichrist supposedly sits in the temple. Well, it's illogical that verses 1 through 31 span over 2,500 years, but verses 31 through 45 happen simultaneously. The first two events in Daniel 11 are very clear, and there are only 10 kings between the two events. And that pattern is consistent throughout the chapter, which is much more logical. Gabriel is very logical. Chapter 11 starts out with King Darius, who ruled from 550 to 486 BC. It starts at Darius and explains all the events over generations in detail that will occur between the persons who represent the king of the north and the king of the south until verse 31 when the abomination of desolation is set up. Jesus said this abomination of desolation that will stand in the holy place at the time of the tribulation is the very abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about, and that includes the detailed timeline in chapter 11. But the majority of the Christian doctrines either ignore or cannot explain Daniel 11. That's the second problem with their doctrine, and it's the biggest problem in my opinion, because you can be led astray into almost any area if you cannot fit the abomination of desolation into the Daniel 11 timeline. So those are the first two problems with their doctrine. Now the third. For those of us who read the English translations of the book of Daniel, we know there are hundreds of translations and they all give slightly varying details. So if we want to know the truth about this book, we must refer to the original language that this was written in. And that's not difficult in this day and age because there are Bible concordances that tell us the original words and their meanings. For example, the word that was translated as abomination in the book of Daniel is Strong's number 8251 in all three chapters. In Daniel 9, abomination is word 8251. In Daniel 11, abomination is word 8251. And in Daniel 12, the word abomination was translated from word 8251. The original Hebrew word is shekutz, and it means detestable thing or idol, abominable thing, abomination, idol, or detested thing. It's been translated in the Old Testament 20 times as abomination. It was translated 5 times as detestable things. It was translated once as detestable, one more time as abominable filth, and one other time as abominable idols. Nowhere in the definition of this word does it say abominable man or abominable person. This word does not refer to a person, it refers to a thing or an idol. So that's the third problem with the standard doctrine. They believe Daniel's abomination is a person, but the original Hebrew word for abomination does not refer to a person. It refers to an idol or a thing. The next problem with the standard doctrine is that it ignores 2 major differences between the events in Daniel 9 and the events in Daniel 11 and 12. The first difference is the word translated as sacrifice. Notice in the King James translation, Daniel 9:27 says that in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. But in Daniel 11 it uses the phrase daily sacrifice. It says they shall take away the daily sacrifice. And in Daniel 12 it also uses the phrase daily sacrifice. It says, and from the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away. This is also the phrase used in Daniel 8. There came forth a little horn, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So in the English translation, this may not seem like a big deal, just the word sacrifice in Daniel 9 versus daily sacrifice in Daniel 8, 11, and 12. But actually it is a big deal because in the Hebrew, they are totally different words, and one of the words doesn't refer to a sacrifice at all. In Daniel 9, the original Hebrew word translated as sacrifice is Strong's number 2077, which is the word zabak. And you can see this word does refer to either the sacrifice of a dead animal or the Passover or a general thank offering. But in both Daniel 8, Daniel 11, and Daniel 12, the original Hebrew word translated as daily sacrifice is Strong's number 8548. And the word 8548 is the word tamid. And the definition of this word here does not even mention a sacrifice. It means continuity, perpetuity, to stretch, continually, continuously, or continuity. It was translated in the Bible 53 times as continually, 26 times as continual, 7 times as daily, 6 times as always, 4 times as always, 3 times as ever, 2 times as perpetual, once as continual employment, once as evermore, and one other time as never. It was never translated as the word sacrifice because the word does not refer to a sacrifice. So unfortunately, the Christian doctrine is based partially on a mistranslation of Daniel 8, 11, and 12. That's the fourth problem. The word in Daniel 8, 11, and 12 translated as daily sacrifice does not refer to a sacrifice at all. The only translation I found that acknowledges that at least somewhat is the Young's literal translation. At least they put the word sacrifice into brackets in both Daniel 8, Daniel 11, and Daniel 12. So at least they acknowledge that the word sacrifice is in question. But what you can see for yourself is that the original word for sacrifice is not anywhere in those verses in Daniel 8, 11, or 12. It's only in Daniel 9. There's another difference between Daniel 9 and Daniel 11 and 12. Both Daniel 11 and 12 say the abomination that maketh desolate will be placed or set up. But in Daniel 9, it says, for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. There are 2 important points here. In Daniel 9, it's the overspreading of abominations, which means there's more than one abomination. There are many abominations at that time. But in both Daniel 11 and 12, it refers to one specific abomination. The second point is that Daniel 11 and 12 say that a specific abomination of desolation will be placed or set up. Notice Daniel 9 doesn't say anything about anything being placed or set up. So standard Christian doctrine is making an assumption that Daniel 9 is referring to the placement of one specific abomination in the midst of the week, when the reality is Daniel 9 does not say that one specific abomination will be placed or set up. It says there will be an overspreading of abominations at that point, not just one idol, but many idols. And it says a desolation will occur because of that overspreading of idols. So the fourth and fifth problems bring to light the ignored differences in Daniel 8, 9, 11, and 12 that make it clear that Daniel 9, the midst of the final week, is referring to a different event than Daniel 11 and 12. First, the sacrifice in Daniel 9 is totally different from the daily in Daniel 11 and 12. It's a different word, and the daily doesn't even refer to a sacrifice. And the second difference between Daniel 9 and Daniel 11 and 12 is that the abomination that maketh desolate in both Daniel 11 and 12 is one specific thing that will be placed or set up. But in Daniel 9, it's referring to more than one abomination. It's referring to the overspreading of abominations, and it doesn't say anything about anything being placed or set up. So if one's argument is that the book of Daniel says the abomination of desolation will be set up in the midst of the week, then that is false. The book of Daniel does not say that. It indicates that might be the case, but it does not explicitly say that. And I think it's very important that we recognize the difference between what the text actually says and what it might be indicating. Because over centuries, some of the ideas and interpretations become doctrine as though they were written in stone. And the truth is, some of these doctrines are not and were never written in stone. So I'm not attacking anyone over this. I think it's a great hypothesis. I think it was a great timeline in its day. However, it has flaws. And if we want to find the truth, we need to recognize those flaws. And especially if Daniel 9 is being fulfilled right in front of us and no one notices because they're stuck in one false interpretation. There are different ways these timelines can play out without changing what the text says, but it's clear that in the midst of Daniel's final week, there will be an overspreading of abominations or idols, not just one. And Daniel 9 indicates that overspreading is the reason the city and the sanctuary will be made desolate. The sixth problem is that many Christians believe the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians is the abomination of desolation, but that's not the case. 2 Thessalonians 2 is talking about the return of Christ, and it says in verses 3 and 4, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he is God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." But notice it says here that the man of sin, the son of perdition, will sit in the temple of God. Jesus said the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place. Even Mark 13 says the abomination of desolation will be standing where it ought not. The word translated as stand is the Greek word histemi, which can also mean stand, set, or place, but it does not mean sit. The word histemi was used in both Matthew 24 and Mark 13, the only scriptures Jesus himself spoke about the abomination of desolation, and he said it will stand in the holy place. In 2 Thessalonians, the word used is kathizo, which primarily means sit. The man of sin who sat in the temple as God was the Pope. For example, in 1512, Pope Julius II was declared another god upon the earth, and in 1890, Pope Leo XII declared that the Pope holds the position of God Almighty on earth. And Pope Leo specifically made this statement while sitting in the Vatican temple. The word for temple in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 actually includes heathen temples. So the man of sin sitting in the temple declaring himself God already occurred. Jesus did not say that would occur in the midst of the final week, and neither did Daniel. Jesus said the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place and referred us not to Paul, but to Daniel, who said the abomination of desolation is not a person, but a thing that will be placed or set up. So that's the sixth problem with the standard doctrine. The man of sin in 2 Thessalonians is not the abomination of desolation. The man of sin refers to the position of the Pope, and this leads us into the seventh problem with their doctrine, because the Pope is identified in Revelation 13 as the Lamb who speaks like a dragon. But it's clear this person represents a separate beast altogether from the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. In verse 1 of Revelation 13, we're told a beast came up out of the sea having 7 heads and 10 horns. And in verse 11, we're told another beast rose up out of the earth. The earth beast is the Lamb who speaks like a dragon, which is identified as the man whose name equals 666. And the sea beast is the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, of which the little horn rises out of. So the seventh problem with the standard doctrine is that they will often claim that the Lamb who speaks like a dragon, with the name equaling 666, is the little horn who will stand in the temple in the midst of the final week. We know this is false because we're told the little horn comes out of one of the heads of the beast with 10 horns. So the little horn is clearly part of the beast with 10 horns and cannot be a separate beast altogether. We're also clearly told that the Lamb who speaks like a dragon is a separate beast. It's not part of the beast with 10 horns, therefore it cannot be the little horn. So the man of sin, the son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians refers to the lamb who speaks like a dragon, but this is absolutely not the little horn. So problem number 7 is very important regardless of who one thinks the 666 man is, because most of the popular doctrines out there are using Revelation 13 as a foundation for their Antichrist theory, and they tie that into the little horn in the midst of the week, and that is logically invalid within the prophecy. The little horn cannot be the man with the name equaling 666. The lamb who speaks like a dragon is not the little horn. The 8th problem with the standard doctrine is that Jesus did not say the abomination of desolation would stand in a temple. That's a problem because the standard doctrine is based on the theory that the third temple must be built in order for the abomination of desolation to stand in it. But if that's true, then why did Jesus specifically refrain from using the word for temple in both Matthew 24 and Mark 13 in regards to where the abomination will stand? The Greek word meaning temple is used in the very first verses of both chapters, but it's not used in reference to the abomination. If it is supposed to mean that the abomination will stand in a temple, then why didn't Jesus just say, when you see the abomination of desolation stand in the temple? He very easily could have said that, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to use the phrase holy place. The fact that he chose not to use the word for temple when describing where the abomination would stand, when he clearly could have, indicates that the holy or sacred place does not refer to a temple. Despite this, the church is adamant that the abomination cannot stand until the temple is rebuilt, yet there is no scripture that says that. Ezekiel speaks about a temple that will be built after the Lord returns to the earth, but that occurs after the beast is totally dead in the prophecy. Jeremiah indicated the temple doctrine is a lie when he said, "Trust ye not in lying words, saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." Paul himself said the Lord will send a strong delusion that they should believe a lie. The very definition of the word delusion means a false belief held despite strong evidence against it. We've been looking at the evidence for years that some of the strongest held convictions of the mainstream Christian churches are actually delusions. It's okay if you think something is true because you lack the information that proves it false. But when millions of people viciously defend something that has been proven wrong by their own holy book, that's a serious problem. Their theories are not being proven wrong by some book they don't even read. Their theories are proven wrong by the only book that they trust. Yet they still insist on believing lies. That truly is the definition of delusion, and that is exactly what Paul said would happen. He said the Lord would purposely cause them to believe the delusion. So it's not an accident that these prophecies are complex. Jesus himself said that he spoke in parables because the mysteries are not meant to be understood by everyone. Gabriel, when giving this prophecy to Daniel, told him it would be written in such a way that the wicked would not be able to understand it. And he said, the words will be closed up and sealed until the time of the end. In other words, the prophecy won't be understood until the end. So he was confirming himself that the ancient doctrines are false. I hope if you're finding this for the first time that you will at least consider the facts that the Bible presents and realize that it's not what the Christian churches are teaching. The 9th problem with the standard doctrine is more elusive than the others because the first thing one realizes when studying this prophecy is that the time of trouble in Daniel 12 is the tribulation that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24. A time of trouble such as never was before, a time of tribulation such as never was before. I thought this myself, but after studying this prophecy every single day for years, you will find that the time of trouble cannot possibly be the tribulation Jesus referred to. It has to be a time of trouble immediately after the tribulation. Here's why. We know the time times in half a time is the length of the time of trouble in Daniel 12. During that time, we're told the saints are in the hand of the little horn. The little horn comes out of the fourth beast in Daniel, and that fourth beast represents a fourth empire that will be destroyed by a stone in Daniel 2, which is a fiery stream in Daniel 7. But after that, it says the beast's lives will be prolonged for a season and a time. In Revelation 13, we're told the beast will continue for 42 months, which is equal to 3.5 years. We're told Babylon sits on that beast, and Babylon will be destroyed by a stone that is thrown down from heaven. So the stone that Daniel tells us will destroy the beast also destroys Babylon, who sits on the beast. And we're told that stone is a fiery stream that is thrown down from heaven. And in Revelation 8, we're told the star that falls from heaven is also burning. So the thing that destroys both the beast and Babylon is a burning star falling from heaven that Daniel called a fiery stream and a stone. It is so clear that this is a meteorite that I don't know why people are still debating the issue. The Bible says a meteorite is going to destroy the beast in Babylon. That's what the falling stars represent. But Matthew 24 tells us the stars will fall immediately after the tribulation of those days, which Revelation 12 makes clear is the 1260 days or years. And Revelation 11 confirms that there will be 3.5 days or years after the 1260 days or years. So if you believe the 3.5 years is the time times in half a time, which most of the Christians do, that means the time times in half a time, or the time of trouble, actually occurs after the tribulation of the days. So let's look at their timeline again. They believe the time times in half a time is the Great Tribulation and will start 3.5 years after the final 7 years begin and end exactly at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. But that cannot be, because we're told the beast's lives are prolonged after the stone hits, and the stone doesn't hit until after the tribulation. If the tribulation is finished at the end of sins altogether, then why are the beasts still alive? It doesn't make sense. So that's the 9th problem with the standard doctrine. The time of trouble in Daniel 12 actually cannot be the tribulation of the days in Matthew 24. It's a tribulation, yes, but not the specific tribulation of the days that Jesus referred to. We're told the time of trouble will occur after the tribulation of the days. It's the time period that the beast's lives are prolonged after the meteorite hits. Revelation 12 confirms that as well when it says the woman flies away at the start of the time times in half a time. And that time times in half a time is when the dragon makes war with the remnant. But the timeline in Revelation 12 also shows that the time times in half a time occur after the 1260 days or years. The woman in Revelation 12 represents 2 different groups of people over time, just like the king of the north in Daniel 11. It's a timeline in Revelation 12. So we'll add that timeline in Revelation 12 to the 9th problem. We have a very clear confirmation in both Revelation 11 and 12 that the time times in half, the 3.5 day or year time of trouble, occurs after the 1260 day or year tribulation. And we also see that is what we're told in the Daniel timeline and the timeline Jesus gave as well. And that leads into the 10th problem with the standard doctrine. Christian leaders acknowledge that Revelation 12 goes right along with Daniel 12 because it mentions the time times in half a time that Daniel 12 says is the length of the time of trouble. They believe it's equal to 1260 days or 3.5 years because Revelation 12 verse 6 indicates at first glance that it is. However, they completely disregard the sign that Revelation 12 tells us must occur before that 1260 days can start. Jesus said, once we see the abomination of desolation stand in the holy place, those in Judea will flee into the mountains, and then shall be great tribulation. Revelation 12 tells us a sign will occur in the heavens, then the woman will flee into the wilderness for 1260 days. So the Christian doctrine agrees that the 1260 days in Revelation 12 is the tribulation of days that Jesus referred to, but they ignore the fact that a very specific heavenly sign must precede that tribulation. So that's the 10th problem with the standard Christian doctrine. They do not even acknowledge that the heavenly sign must occur before the tribulation. They don't even talk about it in church because they think it hasn't happened yet, but it has. So let's go back to the 70 weeks of Daniel. If Daniel 9 is not saying that the abomination of Daniel 11 and 12 will stand in the midst of the 70th week, then what does it say will occur in the midst of the week? It says he, in other words, either the one called Messiah or the prince that shall come, will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and because of the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. It also says, and the end thereof shall be by a flood. And that flood is mentioned in Revelation 12 as well. It occurs at the start of the time times in half a time. In other words, the flood occurs at the start of the time of trouble. So this is another confirmation that the time of trouble starts after the 1260 years of tribulation, because we're told the stone from heaven is going to hit the sea of Babylon, and that occurs at the end of the tribulation of the days. So that stone hitting the sea would cause a tsunami, which could be the flood. And now Daniel 9 indicates the flood occurs within the 7-year week. So not only is the flood after the 1260 years and at the start of the final 3.5 years, but Daniel 9 indicates it is possibly within the 7 years. So this is the true timeline we're given in Daniel 11 and 12. The flood in the midst of the week in Daniel 9 may or may not refer to the stone that will hit the Sea of Babylon. That's why it's a question mark here, because it hasn't happened yet, so we can't be sure. But the texts do indicate that at this point. But notice that Daniel 12 does not say that the 1290 days occur within the time of trouble. Nowhere does it say that. That was an assumption made by the church doctrine, and we can see now that it's not valid. Again, it's important for us to be clear about what is explicitly stated in the text and what is just indicated, because over time these ideas can become doctrine. The text does not explicitly say that the 1290 days occur within the time of trouble. The ceasing of the sacrifice and the overspreading of abominations and the desolation in Daniel 9 that occur in the midst of the final week are not the same events discussed in Daniel 11 and 12. The king of the north takes away the daily, and the king of the north also places the abomination. But in Daniel 11, the king of the north represents many different individuals. Therefore, when Gabriel said, there will be 1290 days from the time the daily is taken away and the abomination set up, he was most likely being very specific. He was giving us both the start date and the end date. The start was the first taking away of the daily by the first king of the north, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and the end of the 1290 days was the king of the north represented by the Pope, the second beast of Revelation. We're told days also represent years, so this 1290-day period equals 1290 years. That is absolutely clear in Daniel chapter 11. It gives us all the details of the events from Darius to the Pope in 685. Everything in Gabriel's timeline is specific, so it doesn't make sense that he would give us the starting event of the 1290 days but not specify what's going to happen at the end of that. It's more logical that he was giving us the start event and the end event. And again, this 1290 days cannot occur during the second half of the 7 years in Daniel, because that would exceed the time allotted. So this is the timeline as it has already played out, exactly as written. The tribulation of the days, we're told, start after that abomination is placed, but that sign in heaven has to occur also before that tribulation can start, and it did. Within that tribulation of 1260 years, the man of sin with the name equaling 666 sat in the temple and declared himself God. But remember, the text is clear. That is not the little horn. That is certain. It's not an indication. It is an absolute certainty that the 666 man is not the little horn. So that already happened. It was documented in the 1800s. Then we're told the stars will fall and the elect will be gathered immediately after that tribulation of 1260 years. And the falling of the stars refers to the fiery stream that is a burning stone that will fall from heaven and destroy both the beast and Babylon that sits on the beast. But the beast's lives will be prolonged after that. It says the beast will continue for 42 months. The woman flies to a safe place for a time times in half a time. And during that time times in half a time, the dragon makes war with the remnant. There's a flood at the start of that final time of trouble, and Daniel 9 says the end will be by a flood and indicates it may occur in the midst of the week. That would explain why Daniel 9 says, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. We're not told the placement of one abomination occurs in the final week. We're told it occurs before the tribulation of 1260 years. The desolation in the final week occurs because of the overspreading of abominations. The idols have been overspread by that point, long after the first one was placed. It's an overspreading by the end of the 1260 years. The 7 years in Daniel are not the tribulation. It does not say that anywhere. I know that's hard to accept when you've been programmed otherwise, but the texts do not explicitly say that. It was only speculation, and the timeline did not play out that way. What this boils down to is that we are literally reaching the end of the tribulation of the days right now, despite the fact that most Christians think we haven't even entered the final week yet. To find out how these prophecies have been fulfilled precisely and are pointing to the years and even the very season we are in right now, please watch the playlist Bible's Countdown to the Meteorite and Rescue, which I've linked here and in the description below this video on YouTube. Thank you so much to those who make this work possible. If you liked this video, please consider providing support because I can't do this without your help. And as far as I know, no one else is bringing this information to light. That's why I have to do it. So I hope you'll look at that playlist if you haven't already. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you next week.